Chapter 14 of The Jewel of Seven Stars. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Jewel of Seven Stars by Bram Stoker. Chapter 14. The Birthmark. During my waiting for the summons to Mr. Trelawny's room, which I knew would come, the time was long and lonely. After the first few moments of emotional happiness at Margaret's joy, I somehow felt apart and alone, and for a little time the selfishness of a lover possessed me. But it was not for long. Margaret's happiness was all to me, and in the conscious sense of it I lost my baser self. Margaret's last words as the door closed on them gave the key to the whole situation, as it had been and as it was. These two proud, strong people, though father and daughter, had only come to know each other when the girl was grown up. Margaret's nature was of that kind which matures early. The pride and strength of each, and the reticence which was their corollary, made a barrier at the beginning. Each had respected the other's reticence too much thereafter, and the misunderstanding grew to habit. And so these two loving hearts, each of which yearned for sympathy from the other, were kept apart. But now all was well, and in my heart of hearts I rejoiced that at last Margaret was happy. Whilst I was still musing on the subject and dreaming dreams of a personal nature, the door was opened and Mr. Trelawny beckoned to me. "Come in, Mr. Ross," he said cordially, but with a certain formality which I dreaded. I entered the room, and he closed the door again. He held out his hand, and I put mine in it. He did not let it go, but still held it as he drew me over toward his daughter. Margaret looked from me to him and back again, and her eyes fell. When I was close to her, Mr. Trelawny let go my hand, and looking his daughter straight in the face, said: "If things are as I fancy, we shall not have any secrets between us. Malcolm Ross knows so much of my affairs already that I take it he must either let matters stop where they are and go away in silence, or else he must know more. Margaret, are you willing to let Mr. Ross see your wrist?" She threw one swift look of appeal in her eyes, but even as she did so, she seemed to make up her mind. Without a word she raised her right hand so that the bracelet of spreading wings which covered the wrist fell back, leaving the flesh bare. Then an icy chill shot through me. On her wrist was a thin red jagged line, from which seemed to hang red stains like drops of blood. She stood there, a veritable figure of patient pride. Oh, but she looked proud! Through all her sweetness, all her dignity, all her high-souled negation of self which I had known, and which never seemed more marked than now, through all the fire that seemed to shine from the dark depths of her eyes into my very soul, pride shone conspicuously. The pride that has faith, the pride that is born of conscious purity, the pride of a veritable queen of old time, when to be royal was to be the first and greatest and bravest in all high things. As we stood thus for some seconds, the deep, grave voice of her father seemed to sound a challenge in my ears. "What do you say now?" My answer was not in words. I caught Margaret's right hand in mine as it fell, and holding it tight, whilst with the other I pushed back the golden cincture, stooped and kissed the wrist. As I looked up at her, but never letting go her hand, there was a look of joy on her face such as I dream of when I think of heaven. Then I faced her father. "You have my answer, sir." His strong face looked gravely sweet. He only said one word as he laid his hand on our clasped ones, whilst he bent over and kissed his daughter: "Good!" We were interrupted by a knock at the door. In answer to an impatient "Come in" from Mr. Trelawny, Mr. Corbeck entered. When he saw us grouped he would have drawn back, but in an instant Mr. Trelawny had sprung forth and dragged him forward. As he shook him by both hands he seemed a transformed man. All the enthusiasm of his youth, of which Mr. Corbeck had told us, seemed to have come back to him in an instant. "So you have got the lamps!" he almost shouted. "My reasoning was right after all. Come to the library where we will be alone, and tell me all about it. And while he does it, Ross," said he, turning to me, "do you, like a good fellow, get the key from the safe deposit, so that I may have a look at the lamps." Then the three of them, the daughter lovingly holding her father's arm, went into the library, whilst I hurried off to Chancery Lane. When I returned with the key, I found them still engaged in the narrative; but Doctor Winchester, who had arrived soon after I left, was with them. Mr. Trelawny, on hearing from Margaret of his great attention and kindness, and how he had under much pressure to the contrary steadfastly obeyed his written wishes, had asked him to remain and listen. "It will interest you, perhaps," he said, "to learn the end of the story." We all had an early dinner together. We sat after it a good while, and then Mr. Trelawny said: "Now I think we had all better separate and go quietly to bed early. We may have much to talk about tomorrow, and tonight I want to think." Doctor Winchester went away, taking, with a courteous forethought, Mr. Corbeck with him, and leaving me behind. When the others had gone, Mr. Trelawny said: "I think it will be well if you, too, will go home for tonight. I want to be quite alone with my daughter; there are many things I wish to speak of to her, and to her alone. Perhaps, even tomorrow, I will be able to tell you also of them; but in the meantime there will be less distraction to us both if we are alone in the house." I quite understood and sympathized with his feelings; but the experiences of the last few days were strong on me, and with some hesitation I said: "But may it not be dangerous? If you knew as we do—" To my surprise Margaret interrupted me: "There will be no danger, Malcolm. I shall be with Father." As she spoke she clung to him in a protective way. I said no more, but stood up to go at once. Mr. Trelawny said heartily: "Come as early as you please, Ross. Come to breakfast. After it you and I will want to have a word together." He went out of the room quietly, leaving us together. I clasped and kissed Margaret's hands, which she held out to me, and then drew her close to me, and our lips met for the first time. I did not sleep much that night. Happiness on the one side of my bed, and anxiety on the other, kept sleep away; but if I had anxious care, I had also happiness which had not equal in my life, or ever can have. The night went by so quickly that the dawn seemed to rush on me, not stealing as is its wont. Before 9 o'clock I was at Kensington. All anxiety seemed to float away like a cloud as I met Margaret, and saw that already the pallor of her face had given to the rich bloom which I knew. She told me that her father had slept well and that he would be with us soon. "I do believe," she whispered, "that my dear and thoughtful Father has kept back on purpose, so that I might meet you first, and alone." After breakfast Mr. Trelawny took us into the study, saying as he passed in: "I have asked Margaret to come too." When we were seated, he said gravely: "I told you last night that we might have something to say to each other. I dare say that you may have thought that it was about Margaret and yourself. Isn't that so?" "I thought so." "Well, my boy, that is all right. Margaret and I have been